Hello, it's Meg Linehan. Welcome to Full Time. I am joined by the Athletics chef Rueter. We are going to go all in on the U.S. Women's National Team. We've got a SheBelieves Cup roster. We've got Emma Hayes, the Women's National Team way. But Jeff, first, what's up? How is Minnesota? Are you currently being the king of the Midwest right now? I feel like you are.
Every day I can be. Yeah, a little less snow than Vermont, more cold. It's that point where it's too cold for snow to fall, and even the snow's like, I don't want this. So we're in the thick of it, but soccer, of course, why not?
Yeah, it feels like preseason, doesn't it? Right?
Yeah.
I think we've got like a full foot of snow outside right at the moment. I'm like, yeah,
right.
Things should be happening on a soccer field.
Right, this is an orange ball podcast. Yeah,
there we go. All right, so again, we're going to be talking all things U.S. Women's National Team. Heard a lot from Emma Hayes over the past week and a half or so. There's always a lot to discuss whenever she gets on a microphone. And yeah, we'll also be breaking down the latest roster for SheBelieves Cup by the end of the show. But before we get there, we've got to do a little news rundown here, because I want to start first where we are back to talking about the core values of the NWSL, whether the league is going to protect its players. Again, I think these questions they're only going to become more frequent, unfortunately. And this is coming up again after executive action from the White House that intends to ban transgender athletes from sport, especially at the lower levels, at the youth levels, at NCAA, and also threatens to cut Title IX funding from schools that do not comply. Now, in the wake of this executive order, we've heard two different responses and two, I would say, very different responses. We've got NWSL Players Association Executive Director Megan Burke talking to BBC News following the settlement with the NWSL and the three attorneys generals. And then the other is from NWSL Commissioner Jessica Berman, who went on Sarah Spain's daily podcast, Good Game. And that was recorded in New Orleans during a Super Bowl Media Day event, Radio Row. So first, before we start the discussion, let's hear from them first.
After Donald Trump became president again, do you feel empowered to remain committed to that moving forward, especially as we're seeing things like the recent executive orders? Does the league policy change at all on trans athletes? Does anything change as a result of what might come from above?
Our focus is on maintaining our core values, no matter who is president, no matter what the political climate. There is no doubt, and our fans tell us consistently, that the NWSL is a place that gives them a sense of belonging, that makes them feel seen, that makes them feel heard. And we're confident that there are so many people in our country that want that enjoy that. And we have no reason to question or doubt whether that is something that will be supported from a business perspective. And so we're going to continue to do all the things that got us here over the last few years and lean into the things that make us unique and differentiated in the marketplace, and be a beacon of hope and light for people who are looking for the things that we have to offer.
Plainly stated, this executive order absolutely does not protect women in sports. Let's be clear and call this what it is. And first of all, I appreciate the question on National Girls and Women in Sports Day, on a day in which the Players Association has made this huge announcement that actually does protect women in sports, given the history of abuse and misconduct in the NWSL. This executive order is a cynical political strategy that is designed to distract from the issues that actually affect Americans.
All right, Jeff, I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I think it's worth doubling back to, I was the one who asked Jessica Berman at the championship in November about, the potential impact of the current president on the NWSL, but also, honestly, like women's sports.
Yeah.
In general. We obviously saw what happened with Barbara Banda, the attack that came on her via social media, including author J.K. Rowling, with questions about her gender, and after winning the BBC Women's Footballer of the Year. I mean, do we feel like this executive order is now putting the NWSL in a different space than it was before?
I think it's, if nothing else, placing what the NWSL does within different context. I think that there's always been, from Donald Trump's White House, a politicalization of female athletes, right? And turning it into a cause and turning it into a smokescreen, a distraction from other policies that might be his, because it's something that has elicited strong reactions, response, feelings from his base, right? And I think it isn't specific to sports. I think that it's pretty clear that these policies, sports is one of the arenas, but this is looking to be a wholesale erasure and silencing of the trans community in America. And this is where it starts, at least policy-wise, just given the time within his tenure with this second term. It does, I would argue, require stronger response from the NWSL, its leaders, its players, its most notable faces, because in general, you cannot require the act of advocacy, change-making, trying to force a better tomorrow onto the backs of the oppressed. You need to have proactive vocal allyship. You need to be able to come out in support. And we saw a bit of that with Orlando's statement, the PA statement after Barbara Banda faced her deluge. And you need more of that. And it requires diligence, consistently plugging in, stepping up, advocating, and not letting this be a thing like, well, there was an executive order, so what can we do? So I think in general, it is a very, it sometimes can put the league into a very difficult situation where it is trying almost too hard at times to overthink what the reaction to the response be, rather than let me say what is either the right thing or the right thing within the confines of where we work. I think that there's a little bit of over consideration that at times can either muddy or completely silence their ability to speak to this. So, I mean, what do you think? Have you seen enough of a response?
I mean, I think the piece that I really would be interested in seeing is almost, I just don't know. I think there's probably a fear also in speaking up and maybe saying the wrong thing too. Mm-hmm. And so I almost, even before I want to see players like really getting active, which I just also, it's really tough because the players are generally getting younger. It's like, do they feel equipped to be in this space? Do they feel equipped to be attacked? Do they feel that they will be supported if they put themselves out there? And so for me, really the part that I want to see is even having some sort of education piece or, you know, boot camp almost for players to go through, and whether that comes from the PA or what, I mean, preferably it would be paid for by the league, right? It's not really on the PA to think about this. Obviously the PA has a stance, and Megan Burke has come out, you know, fiery as always, which I think is an appreciated voice in the space. But can the NWSL partner with someone like Athlete Ally, right, who I think has done work and had a presence at the NWSL Championship as well, right? And can you get them to help players feel ready to go into these spaces, which are like extremely polarized, right? Mm-hmm. And knowing, you know, not everyone is going to be a Becky Sauerbrunn, for instance, right? Who like writes beautiful op-eds, who are so strong and clear in their convictions. Like even smaller things can be important. Here's the language that is helpful. You know, even if you just want to repost stuff, like here's how you can be in this space and feel like you're helping. And if you mess up, here's how you fix that. And you can't let that stop you in the future. And so that to me is like, you cannot get to that bigger goal without having that piece in place. And I don't think that's happening right now.
Yeah, and I think Athlete Ally is specifically a very good shout for a group that does try. Like every year, every winter, they will embed within usually 2 to 4 locker rooms across multiple leagues, the NWSL being one of them, and then a couple of men's leagues as well, and try to have off-season discussions with a focus not on... because, look, inevitably there will be players within the NWSL when we talk about saying the wrong thing. I think that it isn't just how will the public view it, but how will our own employee base, how will our players feel about us speaking collectively for them? Because there are some who won't share the same, if not beliefs and the same kind of view of what's important, but certainly the word choice and the word selection, right? So to be able to have a group like Athlete Ally go in with a lens of education, of retribution rather than punishment, of encouraging and fostering allyship rather than
right?
empowering them rather than silencing them and belittling them, right?
Or feeling like you have to be in this space, like you have to go out and do this. It's just if you want to, like, we are lifting you up in a way.
Right. Yeah.
And that's the vibe I want to see, especially right now, because I think that's maybe where some of the disconnect is happening, and like the way that we're not seeing the league in particular step up in kind of a very like structured way.
Yeah, it feels very much like a tactic that we maybe would have seen from the first Trump era, right? Where it's more like, okay, what are our sponsors going to say as well? And what are our stakeholders? And there's more money in the league now than there was 4 years ago, right? When you look at things like the TV deal, expansion fees, ownership groups' investment in their rosters and their facilities alike. So it is a different landscape than it was in 2020 as well. But that only, in my opinion, increases the burden of responsibility to step up, to be leaders in this space, to be vocal advocates for these people who are having their rights taken away. And thus far, we just haven't seen it to a level of strength that seems befitting for a league of the NWSL stature.
All right. Off the pitch stories have been rife in Europe over the past week, too. On Tuesday in London, Sam Kerr was found not guilty of racially aggravated assault against a police officer. You can go read Tim Burrow's story on how the Chelsea striker now has a chance to look to the future with his trial behind her. Obviously, return is still a little bit off in terms of on the field, but I think probably a relief for everyone involved in that trial. Staying in the WSL, Khadisha Bunny Shaw returned to football after taking a break from Manchester City, having been subjected to racist and misogynistic abuse following a defeat to Arsenal. The latest incident of harassment has led to more demands for the WSL, the English FA, and social media platforms to protect targets of abuse online. That's obviously been such a major focus for women's football in general. And in Spain, Espanyol accused Barcelona's Mapillon of violating, quote, the privacy of their player Daniela Canceres during Sunday's Liga F match between the two clubs. In a statement on Monday, Espanyol wrote that Lyon's actions were, quote, unacceptable and should not go unnoticed. Hours later, Lyon responded with a statement of her own saying, quote, at no time did I violate nor have the intention to violate Caracas. The Athletics Barcelona correspondent Laius Ravello will be following this story closely, as well as the verdict of the trial of Luis Rubiales, the former president of the Spanish Federation, which has been ongoing for the past 2 weeks. Obviously, we've been covering it here at Full Time. But for more, you can head over to The Athletic, where you can get full coverage of all of these stories from across Europe. All right, Jeff and I will be getting into the Emma Hayes, like, true kind of not bound by Olympics.
Yeah.
We're in the 2025. We got a lot to talk about, so stay tuned after this.
Welcome back to Full Time with Meg Linehan. I'm Jeff Rueter. And okay, Meg, before we really sink into what we can learn from this new U.S. Women's National Team roster for the upcoming SheBelieves Cup, I think we need to talk about the broader WNT way. So where do we start? You wrote something for The Athletic about it that was talking about a call that you were a part of that Emma Hayes had, where she was kind of mapping out her vision for not just like the next 4 years ahead of or 3 years, I suppose, ahead of the 2027 World Cup, but looking at a federational level, organizationally, how to change how women's soccer is organized at all levels. So where do you want to begin?
Yeah, first of all, the WNT way does not really roll off the tongue.
No, it does
sorry
not.
Sorry to Emma Hayes. I mean, it was interesting because I do feel like, the way that we've heard this kind of strategic vision talked about, even leading it, we knew that Emma Hayes, as part of that combined January camp between the senior national team and the futures team, had like this idea of, okay, we're going to basically be like shutting ourselves away in a hotel conference room and kind of like shaping this and banging it out, and like I'm going to present it and then it will get refined, and then finally we'll be able to like expose it to the public view and figure out, okay, here's where we're going. And the whole time I'm kind of thinking, okay, it's like this bigger tactical plan to like the continued performance of the senior women's national team. And that is not what we got in the slightest. It really was this very interesting, to say the least, kind of hour-long call of like, yes, there was a presentation. Bless her, Emma Hayes is not good at Zoom, which I do really appreciate.
We all
like,
have our strengths.
Yeah, I mean, like figuring out how to share her screen, not one of them. That's not really her job, so it's fine. Yeah. But I think there was this sense of, you know, the idea of reframing everything through women's soccer, right? The U.S. soccer was built by men, for men, a very long time ago, and now she is literally just like pulling back the curtain and being like, look at all this bias y'all have in here. How do we get rid of it? And that, to me, like, that is just not what I was expecting in the slightest, but it is such an interesting discussion to be having right now.
Of course. And I think that that's probably the justification for the WNT way name, right? It's putting women first, right? It's not US first necessarily, because I think that this is the scale of what she's talking about is a wholesale collective re-examination of how all structures in women's soccer operate, and not making it a carbon copy with like some of the leftovers and the hand-me-downs from men's teams, whether it's the training facilities or the marketing considerations, literally having to like heave the name women at the end of the club name so that people can tell what team you are, right? It's actually looking and saying, how do we specify all decisions, all support structures to ensure that it is tailored for women's soccer. And I think that it's also, just before we get into maybe more of the detail of it, it's just worth mentioning that this is new. And this is kind of a very unique position Emma Hayes is in right now, to be afforded not just the time, I guess, to really go through such an ambitious process and plotting of a potential process, but to also have the good graces and the good standing to be given this sort of freedom to not just be doing this behind the scenes, but also be looping in the media and other stakeholders and saying, this is what I think needs to change, and it'll be out there, and now you can hold us accountable against this rubric, right? I don't think you could really imagine Vlatko ever getting that sort of a runway, Jill Ellis, any number of predecessors. And it's just a very unique byproduct of hiring Emma Hayes, to have someone who has seen this, who has had to lead a lot of these efforts on the club level, and now try to bring that not just to a national team, but like you said, all structures of women's soccer in the United States.
Yeah, and I do think, even going back to the conversation we started the show with, right, I think it is also worth taking a beat here, because there were some points, too, where I was listening to this and I was like, listen, I do think there is no indication that we should not take this entire strategy in good faith. Because I do think, like, when you listen to it and you hear it, totally, like, this is about kind of, like, truly trying to peel back implicit bias and the way that the federation was built. And again, in every single department, not just the technical staff, but she brought up marketing, she brought up HR, right? Like, yeah. One of her really specific examples was, you know, I mean, and she mentioned like playing in white shorts, right? Like that, right. No one really ever thought about that until finally someone was like, why are we doing this? Right?
Yeah.
But also even something as small as someone posts a kind of unflattering photo of a player to Instagram, and then that player sees it and she's like, that could be weeks of work for me, where the player is thinking about their self-worth, their body image. Like, you just have to unpack all of the potential consequences of these very small decisions. And so, like, all of that is good. But then also, I think some of the language around it, especially in this current environment that we find ourselves in America, I am a little hesitant of, like, you know, fundamentally this is still soccer at the end of the day. Like, I do think women's soccer has differences from men's soccer, and those are good and different, right? But you can't kind of be like, I think the framing device is important, but fundamentally at the end of the day, like, you have to understand that there are things that will overlap. And it's refreshing to hear Emma Hayes saying, like, I don't care what the men's team is up to. Yeah, totally. Why would you? Right?
Yeah.
Fine. Great. I love that for you. But you cannot stray kind of into this territory where people are going to maybe look at some of this language and be like, oh, women's, like, females,
Yeah.
right? Like, as soon as females gets used as a noun, it's kind of like, I feel like a little radar goes off somewhere,
Yeah.
and you're into danger territory. And so, like, that's where I do think taking the beat and being like, I fully want to read this in good faith, but I think you also have to be aware that people could take this and run with it in a direction that becomes honestly dangerous.
Right. I think one area that she focused on that I think actually does help with some of these, certainly the internal structure and how this is perceived by the players, by the parents of players at the youth levels, the comfort of just of the club community atmosphere, all of that is focusing on coaching. And obviously part of this is she's a coach. She knows what the job looks like. She can very credibly speak to what the day-to-day consequence of the implementation of some of these processes are better than other leaders at the federation who have never coached and certainly have not coached as long as she has. But I think that there's also the nature of the coaching job is essentially that of a middle manager, right? Where you do still have bosses that you report to, but you are in charge of your direct reports. And we've all had middle managers in our careers who we have really jibed with and who we feel that we've been seen by and we've been more productive because of that human interaction, and we've had the opposite, right? And so to be able to have someone looking and saying, we need to really focus in on making sure that this group, coaches, are best equipped to navigate this, because yes, it'll help player development, but it will also help all levels of it. I think that that's really smart because they are the ones who will have the most direct interactivity, not a club director at a youth level, not a GM at a pro level, but a coach is going to actually have those conversations every single day and make those observations on the fields and in the locker rooms and everywhere in between to understand what is going on. And I think that that is going to be vital as we talk about some of these changes being made.
Yeah, 100. I mean, like, she focused so much on coaching education of just, like, why isn't there a director of coaching education on the women's side, which I think is 100, like, and it's
Great
such
question.
a kind of, like, immediate thing that you can look at and be like, okay, that's fixable right now. Like, from the jump. You make one hire, and then suddenly a whole bunch of other pieces fall into place. So there were some immediate things. Obviously, there were some bigger, strategic goals around just, like, beyond the, okay, remove biases, right? Whatever that may end up looking like. But there is this sense of, what was interesting too is that winning truly did not come up on that call a lot, almost until the end when someone pointed out, like, you actually really haven't talked about winning, which has been such a part of the DNA of the women's national team over the years. And for her, I think it really is about how do you create the best possible environment? How do you keep players in that environment for as long as possible and don't make them feel alienated at any point, like, especially at the youth level, right? And so I think you combine this women's national team way and then the way that she had kind of this passing line of, and I think this was kind of more a reference to what Michelle Kang has done, right? Where she has donated an absurd amount of money to U.S. soccer that is specifically focused a lot at the youth levels. And the way that U.S. soccer is now kind of really seeking out those big donations to then activate a lot of these kind of more internal plans beyond, the training center in Atlanta, that sort of thing.
Right.
And so you can tell that Emma Hayes is, like, really bullshit. And also is just like, this is what I was born to do, right? Like, she is feeling the energy of being given the project of her life and being let loose, right?
Yep.
Like, she has been, the Federation hasn't, like, opened the doors and said, root around all you want, go for it.
Right.
And that to me is also just, we just have never seen that energy out of U.S. soccer, really.
No, it's handing a very capable sculptor a bounty of the finest clay in the world and saying, let's see what you can do, right? And I think that the reality of it is when we think about, let's say, 26 years ago, right? And we say, what is it going to take for the U.S. women's national team to continue to be at the top of women's soccer? Well, a lot of it was about quality of players, accessibility for young players to start playing the game. And then eventually, of course, you needed to build a solid, dependable foundation. You needed a strong domestic league. So then that gets you 2015, 2019, right? What is the next one? Treat them like people. And also recognize that there is a difference between
What
like,
a concept.
coaching.
Treat them like people. Who knew?
Yeah, and just meet them with, like, recognize, like, okay, look, like you said, with the considerations of social media posts, for example, great example, right? I don't think that that's something that you're necessarily expecting to hear as much from, like, a high school boys player as certainly you might from a high school age girls player, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense, actually being proactive to say, how do we, I don't know, kind of make that more uniform and actually make it more dependable and consistent, where we know that these aren't going to be as common of factors that players run into in their careers as they're coming up from the youth levels, that can only help the senior national team. And then at that point, you are backing yourself as a coach. If you're Emma Hayes, you are backing the quality of your players, your support staff, all of this, to be able to take players who are more comfortable with being professional soccer players and then actually work with that to make something more sustainable and a high level.
All right, before we move into SheBelieves Cup roster, I one last point on this, because what is interesting is obviously Emma Hayes' playground right at the moment is U.S. soccer, right? Mm-hmm. But there is this sense of, she talked very briefly about the 2031 World Cup being on the list of goals, which is, that's a whole other podcast of how that's going to play out right now, of how bid will go over with Mexico right at the moment. But there is also this sense of that greater global influence that U.S. soccer, I think, has always especially felt like they want to be able to exert on the women's side. And Emma Hayes saying, we have to impact FIFA, we have to impact UEFA. Obviously, she is a little more cognizant than most of what UEFA is up to.
That's
we
right.
have to impact governments across the world, which isn't going to be easy. And so it is kind of interesting putting some of, like, again, the basics of treat them like people to how do you then take that and make it an action that you can then say, okay, the government of, whatever country, whoever's got Euros in another 4 years, or like,
right,
here's what we've done. Now run with it. Like, where do you see this going? Because it's not an immediate project, I don't think, either, right?
No, far from it. But I think that this is the direction it needs to head. If you're any federation that expects to remain in contention at a high level in women's soccer, right? Because I think that you saw it, even with the equal pay push, right? And then seeing other federations and other groups of players feeling more empowered, and then also having the vocal support of the U.S. women's national team behind them, and that being a case study to say, yeah, this is worth fighting for, and yeah, it's achievable. And so I think it's about being, it's a different form of trailblazing, right? In the sense that it is trying to standardize and improve at all levels of it. And I think that if you can execute that vision very well, it does provide a blueprint where other federations can look and say, we might not have the GDP of the United States, and we might not have the number of cities or whatever with all of these clubs and structures, but here are the parts of it that we can use and refine to make our own. And that is invaluable to be able to make that sort of change beyond the United States.
Yeah, that straight up, she was just like, if we can create this example, right, of this is how it could work, that is always immediately a much easier step than yelling at someone being like, well, don't do it like that. If you give them the blueprint, yeah, perfect. All right, on to SheBelieves Cup, somehow the 10th edition of this tournament, which... Already. Like, I knew that intellectually, but then I thought about aging, how old that makes me feel, and I did want to die inside. But also, like, congrats to Emily Sonnet on her roster for her 10th SheBelieves Cup.
Crazy.
Now, sadly, no Alyssa Nair to be there with her. Hopefully, Emily, if they win, gets a T-shirt again.
Yeah.
But yeah, the big picture coming out of this, Jeff, has to be... This is still 2025 is the year of, like, we're gonna throw things at a wall and see what sticks, right?
Yeah, and it's earned, right? You're still a couple of years out from the World Cup. You're not thinking about qualifying yet. I remembered yesterday that there isn't another Gold Cup until 2029.
I know, it's
which
so weird.
Is too bad, because that was a very helpful and fun tournament. But I digress. So you have a year now where you can truly examine a broader portion of your player pool if you're Emma Hayes. You don't have the same pressure to call in your same, let's say, core 15, 20 players on every squad, right? You don't need to ensure... You don't have the same caliber of games where you need to ensure that you are built to like dominate every single game, right? You can have some tough learning moments against good opponents and throw players who have not been put in these spots before into these spots against opponents that they could feasibly face in an Olympics or a World Cup and then go from there. So, yeah, it's a very different squad. There are a lot of players that I think fans would expect to see who were not called in for various reasons. And
a lot of injuries still.
Yep, and a lot of players who now have opportunities, great opportunities, to make a good impression, either on the back of some of these like post-Olympics camps that they've had from the fall into January, or fresh faces altogether who are finally getting that look.
Okay, before we get into who's actually at camp, real quick, let me run down. Still no triple espresso. All of them are in various forms of coming back, right? Mm-hmm. Naomi Girma is still coming back from that calf injury. She's still over in England. We saw her like doing very light training, you know, the photos coming out of that from Chelsea. And then Rose Lavelle had ankle surgery and is still recovering from that. So those are kind of like the big five, I would say. Yeah. On the flip side, we got to talk about Kat Macario. It's finally back. How exciting. Yeah. Love it.
A third, fourth chance at a first impression, unfortunately. Right? And that's kinda, been that's been like the frustrating part of all of this is there's never been a question in certainly our minds, but I think many people's minds that like Kat Macario belongs on this team at this level as one of those core 15 I was talking about a little bit ago. Injuries have made that unfortunately a very difficult proposition. But now I think we have to I would challenge fans almost to just like go in with like no preconceptions of what to expect from Kat Macario. Like down to even like, does it make more sense to just see what she could do leading the line at striker versus playing as that number 10 role? Do we need to throw her back in the midfield to get more touches and see what that does for our game model? And also just like what kind of dynamism and like physical execution of her flicks and tricks and all of that sort of stuff is still confidently in her bag right now as she's at this point of recovering from the latest bout of injury. So it's just going to be a joy to see her play again, period. I think that that's already the success of having her at this camp is keeping her through the end of this camp healthy. But yeah, what else what are you hoping for or expecting to see from her in this grand return finally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is just... I want to see her on a field a few times with Jaden Shaw. Like that to me is kind of the most interesting combination because also, I mean, I think you could just kind of throw them both on the middle of the field and be like, figure it out in real time. Let's find out what the two of you can do chemistry wise because like we just haven't really seen it. But I think one of the really interesting points that you made about Kat too is that this is kind of her third or fourth attempt at that like true grabbing of attention. And what has been interesting is we've always seen that kind of sense of the next big thing, right? And this isn't even a U.S. women's national team thing. Like, this is a U.S. soccer thing in general. But, you know, Mal Swanson was that player for such a long time and then, you know, kind of in and out and then back in and obviously has become such a, like, crucial part of the forward line. Then it was Kat and now I think it's Lily Johannes, right? Like, she's kind of... immediately that thing of like everybody's going like, oh, we got to get her, you know. And with Kat, there was such a big discussion around like, is she gonna pick the U.S., right? Had her choice between U.S. and Brazil. She was being wooed. Citizenship was, you know, like needed to happen. And so I think the question is can you even like use that framework around her anymore? Because like I don't think it's helpful, but also I don't know if you can ever really escape that framework once it's been put upon you.
No, not at all. And I think that, I mean, to talk about Mal, for example, too, right? Like, because that was a case also of a very talented player who had a very versatile and dynamic skill set, right? And so there is also just a question of fit. I think we know generally to get the most out of Kat Macario, you want her in the center of the field. You want her to get on the ball a good amount, and good things will happen. Right? But I think the reality now is we're at a point where, like, if you just think of how many games the U.S. Women's National Team plays a year, right? Kat Macario debuted in 2021. Macario has 19 caps To put that into perspective, like 19 is not nothing, right?
No, but yeah, it's not
for
ever where
reference-
we thought. Yeah.
For reference, in 2024 alone, Sam Coffey made 21 appearances. So, like, less than a year's worth of caps over the last 4. So there is a lot of synergy with teammates that she just hasn't been able to build in the same way because she hasn't been available, and she didn't predate this sort of like 2023 cycle turnover in the same way that Rose Lavelle would have, where there is just kind of some natural continuity for all the camps that she has to miss with injury as well. So it's just kind of important to rebuild and say, like, look, we were trying to bring you in to get used to, late stage Megan Rapinoe and Alex Morgan and kind of the onset of Triple Espresso and all this. And
Yeah,
now,
sorry, late stage Megan Rapinoe. It's just
I'm sorry, just like late career. I'm so sorry. But like now you are to a point where you are moved on to, okay, we are fully into the changing of the guard. We need you to be one of those veterans, and you haven't had that experience to build those sorts of relationships yet.
Yeah. All right,
Late
so let's
stage
talk
Megan
about
Rapinoe, yikes.
let's talk about what we should actually see. They're playing Japan, Australia, Colombia. They're all pretty familiar opponents. I think, we're not going to be surprised by what these 3 games are going to feel different, but we know exactly probably what to expect out of all 3 of them. Mm-hmm. We know that there are Brazil games on the horizon in April, which I think are going to be kind of like the biggest bang for the buck, at least in this first half of the year, right? We know that we had a January camp that we don't really have a lot of data from because it was a training camp and obviously a different roster. So, where are we at right now? Again, for me, it's just, it always comes back to this idea of she is picking her way through the pool. Emma Hayes just going, okay, I want you to get some time. 10 players on this roster have 4 or fewer caps.
Yeah.
It's the Emma Hayes experience right now, right?
Because you would usually only see, 2, 3 very untested players per camp over, if I'm just thinking of the last almost decade, right? You're kind of microdosing in your fresh faces rather than this sort of wholesale, you know what, we just got to get them caps eventually, right? And ultimately it's that classic, you can't get experience until you get chances. And so it's good to see a tournament like this is still important every year because it is a safe opportunity to make selections like these and to be able to try, if I think of last year when Twyla Kilgore was interim manager, at that point then it was also a shift of philosophy, and it was sort of, okay, we know what Emma Hayes is going to want to do, so how do we set our players up to be ready when Emma Hayes can't be here yet, right? So you're able to take some of these grand experiments more frequently. There are some of those players that I'm actually very excited to see, and I think that, first of all,
let's talk about players that you're excited to see, because obviously, again, we've got some younger talent, 3 players coming in from the Futures Camp.
Yep.
I wanted to pick your brain on maybe 3 players people should be watching.
Yeah, and I think, first of all, it's a last name that's going to be very familiar. It's Thompson, Giselle Thompson, which is fun. I mean, chance for the first sisters to play for the national team at the same time since the Mewis sisters. So that's nice. Right-footed, Angel City mostly played her as a left back, so can play defensively either side, which is good. We've seen, whether it's Crystal Dunn, Emily Fox, that is something that does help a player stay in the national team, that positional versatility. And Emma Hayes loves a player who can play multiple positions to have that tactical flexibility, especially in a tournament. She's a very proactive tackler. She is someone who actually ranked very high for NWSL players of any age in terms of her frequency of attempting tackles, and her success rate was very high, especially for a player as young as she is. She's a very good one-on-one defender. She can create some chances as well, but is still, and this is important for a young player, I think, because so often there's that tendency, you just need to do something to make an impression, right? And so young players will go out there and they'll kind of force passes and take shots that maybe a veteran would never consider, right? There isn't really that visible instinct in her game yet, and I think that that's something that's going to help her translate very well. So very excited to see Giselle Thompson as part of this camp.
All right. Do you have any other, I feel like defenders, Emma Hayes talked about defenders a lot in her call after the roster dropped. And that was really, I think, a real stress for her of like, we've got to get defenders experience. So who else maybe should we be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, it's a thin group right now. And you think back to like the start of the Olympics, and 2023 World Cup, they brought in 3 center backs, right? And probably the same number for the Olympics as well. So Emily Sams continuing to get looks on the back of a very, very good career establishing 2024 season on all fronts is a very good thing for her development. She's a player who also has that big game experience. Again, kind of a bedrock of the Orlando Pride's title-winning defense, which was why Barbara Banda and Marta were able to do their thing, because the defensive side was doing their job so well. She has that sort of defend smarter, not harder instinct, which I think is also very valuable at this level, to not have someone who always needs to be gliding on the ball and maybe, accidentally once in a while get the ball poked off of their foot. Someone who's very comfortable dribbling around, passing it off, and then getting right back into position. She's also right-footed. And I know that that's something where usually when you talk about defenders, it's like, well, yeah, most people are right-footed. But the thing is right now, at the center back pool, you have Naomi Girma, left-footed, Tierna Davidson, left-footed, Sam Staub often plays on the left side. There's some contentiousness, weirdly, about what her preferred foot is if you look at multiple sources, but she plays on the left, whether it's with Washington or with the Chicago Red Stars last year. So to have someone who actually is like, no, the right's great, that actually will be valuable to keep her in this pool as we're looking ahead between now and, let's say, 2027. So I think really good for Emily Sams to be in this camp, and then hopefully we'll see as players return, as Girma gets back into the mix, as Sam Staub comes back from injury. I think that Emily Sams has proven that she can be part of that conversation for every camp.
All right, one more name for you, Jeff. Let's talk about Allie Sentner.
Yeah, who had another player who had like a big 2024, obviously a big part of that Youth World Cup run, but also was already the focal point of an NWSL attack last year. And Utah Royals improved as the season went on. They made some changes that really helped them out, both tactically and with personnel. But Sentner was kind of the one point of continuity after being drafted first overall in the final NWSL draft. She is happy to take a shot. She loves it. She loves a shot from deep as well, which if nothing else helps keep a defense honest. But she also can create. She is a player who wants to get assists as well, not just a volume shooter, which I think is very important. It's going to be especially interesting to see how she fits in a team where she isn't the focal point, though, because I think with that youth international team as well as Utah, it was still her leading the charge, right? So, but when you see a player of her caliber play with other players of her caliber with more experience, that's when you start to see some of these things where there's just kind of interesting things happen, right? And just in general, different parts of their game come out. You kind of saw it with Jaden Shaw, I guess, early last year as well, with her acclimation into the national team. And just you can kind of envision how you fit in better once you're playing on a team like the U.S. Women's National Team. No kidding. So it's just going to be very good to see her tested at this level. I hope she gets some good minutes. We'll see where she goes from here. But it's going to be a very big second season for her when the NWSL season starts as well.
Totally. All right. Well, obviously, SheBelieves Cup is around the corner. So many teens on this roster, too. Again, like...
So many.
It's just, aging is delightful. Anyway. All right. Did you know that The Athletic has partnered with Yahoo Sports to provide free best-in-class coverage of women's sports? You can check out the Women's Sports Hub at sports.yahoo.com/women's-sports. We've also put that link for you in the show notes because it's a lot of words for you to follow online. All right. My name is Meg. I am alongside Jeff Rueter, King of the Midwest, as we have crowned him on today's episode, and you have been listening to Full Time with Meg Linehan. If you want, endless Vermont snow and ski content, you can find me on Instagram and Blue Sky.
And thanks for having me. Again, I'm Jeff Rueter, infrequent guest of Full Time with Meg Linehan. I'm a senior writer at The Athletic. You can find all of my stuff over there. I'm more active on Blue Sky these days than anything else, and I'll be part of our SheBelieves coverage, so looking forward to covering that.
All right, if you want to hit us up with any questions, comments, whatever else you might want to send us, you can email us at fulltime@theathletic.com. Full Time does not happen without podcast producer Theo Lloyd Hughes, video producer Leah Griffin, and executive producer Emily Olson. We will be back with you as usual next Thursday.